couple of weeks ago, I talked just kind of in passing about some rocks that we had run into over in the desert out on 25 Road, and they're all over the place out there, of course. And this is just a small sample. I'll show you a few more here in a minute, but I wondered how they got there, you know, because my first thought was, well, the stream washed them down. But then where did the water from the stream come from? It would take quite a stream to move. Some of these are like the size of a car, you know, they're pretty large. And so that part didn't make sense. And I started thinking, well, maybe these boulders were part of the ocean bottom that used to be here. They say there were two different periods where there were oceans covering all of us, and then another period where there was a lake. And so maybe this was part of the ocean bottom or the lake bottom, whatever, and they eroded out, these stones eroded out. So I'm on a Facebook site. I was invited this week, in fact, to one called Landscapes and Nature and Wildlife of America. It's a place where you post photographs, and I was invited to join that site, which I felt was quite an honor because they'd been watching some of the stuff I'd been posting. But so I knew there was, and this is a different site, I knew there were a couple of geologists on that site, so I thought I would take some pictures and stick them up there and just see what they said about it. So some weeks ago I mentioned a field of boulders I've observed in the desert area north of Grand Junction. I mentioned them because I couldn't understand how they could have ended up where they are. And if you can see in this photo, they stretch a ways and they're pretty sizable. Knowing there were a couple of geologists in this Facebook group where I post photos, I asked if anyone had some ideas. Well, it was not a geologist that responded first. It was apparently a Christian fundamentalist. He said, read your Bible. The great flood of Noah's time and its resulting runoff is responsible for most of the world's geological mysteries. So I thought, that's interesting. That's what a lot of people believe. And actually, I believe it also, but maybe not quite like our friend here. And so I responded, I won't argue religion here. That was not the place to do it. Only to say that I cannot take Noah and the ark literally. However, the Ice Age floods could very well have inspired that story, since ocean levels rose 400 feet or so. And his response was, a minister who refuses to believe the word of God. Good luck with that. So you know where he was telling me to go, actually. But this is an ingrained attitude, and my response to him is something I have kind of learned just over the last several years of the connection, possible connection between the Ice Age floods and the flood story that we find in the Bible. And what is interesting is that I don't think there, from what people say, the experts say, there's not any culture that does not include a flood story of some kind. And so the general thinking is that maybe there was an actual event and it's all tied in to that, and these different myths and legends sprang from that actual experience. Because it's a well-accepted idea that sea levels did rise 400 feet. Now, if you think of that happening today, you know, that would wipe out all of our coastal major cities. There would be nothing above water, you know, for a long way. 400 feet would go inland a long way. Miami, New York, Los Angeles, you know, all these metropolitan areas on the coast would be gone. So you think, what kind of an impact would that have on people 12,000, 15,000 years ago? It would have the same impact that it would on us now. How long would we talk about that? And of course, back then they didn't have the reading, writing sophistication that we have now, but they still told the story. They still would tell the story. So I think what happened is, let me get here. Oh, another reader said, "You're the first minister I've ever witnessed say something like that. I feel like you make me want to study the Bible again. Just wanted you to know." So I want that person in our church here. We want them. So there's these two things, and actually I got a lot of responses from other people along this line. It seems like there is not a whole lot on that particular side anyway that embrace literally the story of Noah and the ark. But can that story be based in a fact? And I think that's what so much of the Bible is. It's stories that are based in fact, but they themselves are not fact. They are built up around something else, around the mythology of the culture that they're engaged in. So actually the biblical flood story comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Babylonian myth. And it was discovered sometime back on these clay tablets. This is tablet number 5 of 12 that they have discovered, but there's a flood story on there. And in that flood story, the hero, his name is Utnapishtim. Wouldn't you like to have that on your driver's license? I like J. That's a lot easier. But there's a flood story, and the hero was warned by the gods that the world was going to be destroyed with a flood, to build a boat, to bring on animals. It's almost identical to the Noah flood story. And even at the end, when he's trying to figure out if the waters are receding, he releases a raven, whereas Noah releases a dove. But he releases a raven, and the raven doesn't come back, so they know there must be land out there now. So what's interesting about that, the reason that is relevant to the Bible story is because the Babylonians were in, the Hebrews were in Babylonian captivity. And I think it was 586 they were taken captivity. So they were under the influence of Babylon for a long time. So they would have naturally adopted some of their ideas, some of their stories, and so on. So we can trace this story back, and it's very hard to deny it. When you read them both side by side, it's very hard to deny that they're not related. And what's also interesting is when you look at the Bible story itself, the flood story, it's actually two stories combined. And I once took the pains of separating those out according to what the critical scholars recommended. And you'll see two entirely different stories. One, Noah gathers 2 animals of every kind and puts them in the ark and all of that. And in the other, it's 7 animals of every kind. Well, some of the Christian fundamentalist commentaries that I've read said, well, they took the 7 of every kind to eat. That was dinner, so they had to gather them separately. So they would deny there's 2 stories here, because after all, Moses sat down and wrote all this out, and he knew what he was talking about. But these 2 stories were floating around in an editor, people we don't know how it happened, but they put them both together. And I would just say, read the flood story in the Bible, and just you'll see some discrepancies that are hard to explain, other than this was 2 stories that are woven together. And it's like there'll be 2 verses from one, then 1 verse from one, and 2 verses from one, and it's once you see it, you can't help but see it. Once you see it, it's all you see. So the story is a combination, the biblical flood story is a combination of 2 stories, one saying 2 of every kind, the other 7. Both stories are likely derived from a much older Babylonian myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh. You can look that up too. I would recommend that you do that. Some of this stuff is very boring to read, but it is. It helps us to, not explain all of the geological problems with a flood story that we find in the Bible. What I would say is we appreciate the Hebrew for what they were doing, for how they wrote, how they saw the world. But if I'm a minister that doesn't accept the Word of God as the literal Word of God, then that means I don't believe the world is flat. I don't believe that on the outer edges there's this bowl, this dome called a firmament, that attached to that firmament are these things called stars and the sun and the moon that are the size of apples and melons. So if I don't accept the world as the Hebrew saw it, I'm not a good minister. I'm not in keeping with the Word of God. So that's the kind of thing, and I wondered, there's got to be a sermon in here someplace. There's got to be a talk in this response someplace. And it's a very typical response, from this mentality that we look at the Bible. I think Emerson said perhaps it's because it's dressed in black. It looks like it's very formidable, very something we've got to believe. Well, I believe the Bible, but I understand the consciousness out of which it was written, and I can allow the Hebrew to say the world is flat. It's okay. From their point of view, from their understanding, the world was flat, and you can understand how they could come to that decision, how they could come to that conclusion, because it looks flat. I used to live in Texas, and it was flat. There's no question about it. And in Texas, they think the end of the world drops off the northern border. That Oklahoma doesn't even exist. It's like, that's how we perceive things. It's not, I'm just joking about that, of course, sort of. But the Hebrew believed that because they didn't have trains and planes and cars and ways to travel great distances in short periods of time. And we do. And we not only have that technology, we can fly out into space, we can send a Hubble up, we can send all kinds of photographic equipment up and take pictures of what we see out there, what's out there. And so, but why throw the Bible away just because the Hebrew thought the world was flat? That's not the criteria for calling it worthless. What is worthless is taking the Hebrew literally, taking that work literally, and not taking into context where they were scientifically, instrumentally, technologically, but where they actually were. And all of the cultures that we call mythological, they come up with these stories that seem so fantastic, but they are probably all based somehow in a grain of truth, in a grain of fact. So I could see a catastrophic event happening, sea levels rising 400 feet. The civilizations then would be just like they aren't any civilization then. And of course they say, well, there was no civilization that far back, but there were people. And we don't know for sure if there were civilizations. With the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, it kind of threw a wrench in some of the civilization thinking, because it's a pretty sophisticated site that they're dating, I think, back 14,000 years or so. But it is, there's a lot of things we don't know about that. But it would make perfect sense that if something that major happened, and it did, there's not much doubt about it, these major floods, that story would be continued to be told for a long time, and it would turn into myth. It would turn into something that's not historically factual, but it would be based in. So you come up with this idea, well, humankind, was becoming kind of evil, and God was up there looking at us and just grew disgusted with what he was seeing, so he decided to cause a flood and just clean it all up. So he does this. Noah floats around. First of all, think of that problem of gathering 2 of every kind or 7 of every kind, 1 of every kind. You try to catch a cat and put it on an ark. That's like, it'd be a big job. And when you think about how impossible that would be, and how big would that ark have to be to accommodate that, well, the Bible kind of shows what Noah went through, because after that time of floating around with all those animals, first thing he does when he hits land is he grows a vineyard and gets drunk. He just thinks, enough of that. So there's all kinds of things. I mean, do you take all that literally? Could he have planted a vineyard, grown the wine, and gotten drunk? And there's a worse part. There's a dark side to that story too, but we won't go into that because we don't have time. It's too interesting. So the geologist offered some fascinating explanations of how the boulders may have been placed. None of their explanations lessened my faith or undermined my interest in the Bible. Now, what this one fellow in particular said, and I'll say he was a geologist who worked this area. He knows the Book Cliffs very well. And he was a prospector for uranium in his day. I think he's retired now. I don't know a lot about him, but he's very familiar with the Book Cliffs in this area. So anyway, you see these rocks out there. They're good size. They're covered in lichen. What he says is, as we know, just drive through Palisade and look at what's going on there. You'll see the whole base of the cliffs is littered with these boulders. What he's saying is these things drop off, and there's an example over in Palisade. They drop off and they sit there for a long time. And this is another feature that I want to talk about. It's Mancos Shale, right? Mancos Shale. You're all familiar with that. It's very common stuff, and I'm looking at it in a little bit different way. But just keep that kind of right in your mind. When you look at the Book Cliffs, you see this at the bottom. That's the bottom part of it. So what he's saying is these boulders, they drop off, and you see this group of hoodoos. They look like a line of monks, standing there meditating, and they probably are meditating, but these boulders drop down and they sit there and then they're eroded. And he's saying that the Book Cliffs are moving, they're eroding, they're going north and over a long, long period of time. So the boulders that you see out in the desert, and this is his suggestion, it's not set in concrete or set in shale or whatever. It is, but he says your picture here is evidence that those boulders dropped and now what was around them is gone. So that movement is happening and we don't see it. It's so slow we don't see it. But that's the idea. So when you go out there and look at these things, they're covered with lichen. The ones that have fallen at the base of the Book Cliffs are not, because they have not been out there long enough. That lichen grows very slow. And that's a whole other study I've discovered. People devote their whole careers to understanding lichen. Interesting stuff. It's beautiful. When you look at it on the boulders, it's beautiful, and to think of it's a living entity. But you don't see it at the base of the cliffs. At least I haven't seen it, and I've been looking lately. So there's one woman even suggested, that was the skull of a T-Rex. And I thought, well, I never thought of that. But then I started looking at it real close. And I thought, yeah, you could kind of see that if you look close enough. But I had Beth stand beside it just to show the scope of it, how big it was. But what appears to be going on is that the cliffs are moving away from us. And if you look around Grand Junction, you'll see these hills all over the place, these gray hills. I was looking out my window this morning at one I have seen 1,000 times, and it just dawned on me that maybe the Book Cliffs were sitting on top of Grand Junction at one point, and they've eroded back to where they are now. Because in front of them, you see these standalone hills. They call them the Badlands. But like that was probably part of the Book Cliffs, and then you come forward a little bit and you'll see these hills around here and probably all the same thing. So what does that have to do with anything spiritual? it's very possible that all of this happened as part of that flood 15,000 years ago. It's very possible that we were part of that here. And this kind of throws a whole different light on the Bible story. It's possible that we're part of that Bible story. It's possible that we are grounded in the history, in the fact of what happened that caused the Bible story to be written. And so it throws a whole new light on, and what this says to me is we've got to keep our minds open. I don't think I'm of this earth. This is not my home. But isn't it a fascinating place to temporarily live? And the more that, and I've talked to this geologist sort of on the side, and it makes you see your environment in a very different way. And I'm not saying this is something that's totally enlightening. You know, Emily Cady says geology is not the answer that we're looking for. The answer we're looking for is not found in geology. She didn't say it wasn't interesting. She didn't say that it wasn't an interesting part of our history, and it's actually tied into the guy that the fundamentalist on Facebook was right, that all of the geological features that we see around us probably are tied in some way to the Bible stories. And it just kind of brings that to a different place, that the land upon which we walk may very well have been touched by the thing that inspired that particular story. And who knows how many more. And if you look at that area over there, the Middle East and Near East, it looks a lot like this area. But what scientists say is, as the ice sheets were melting, you know, it caused these massive floods like we've never seen, no human being has ever really seen. But we see the evidence of it. And I pointed out up in Washington, in particular, the state of Washington, the Dry Falls area, Scablands they call it, where it's pretty dry now, but there's evidence of a humongous flood. And they look at Mars and they see this same footprint. They see, it looks like there's been humongous floods up there. Somebody thinks that it was hit with a meteor and poked a hole in the crust and it flooded out, and it's all very fascinating. But that's the whole idea of the flood and how it was used is what's important to us from a spiritual point of view. The principle behind it is the need for cleansing, that our consciousness becomes cluttered. And so we need to have this flood. We need to take what is valuable into ourselves and, you know, I guess determine what is valuable and let go of the rest because it's just baggage that we don't need. The flood story is about cleansing. That's the bottom line. No matter what culture you're from, that's what it's about. Evil has built up according to that story, and it's time to get rid of it, so we have this flood. And the ancient Hebrew, that's the only mechanism they would have known. They wouldn't have said, you know, Noah was instructed to build an atomic bomb and just bomb the heck out of everything. Nowadays, that would probably be the remedy. I mean, how to, in a story, how the hero would have to end the world. But back then it was a flood. But the idea is cleansing, so we can see that in our own life, in our own experience. So I just wanted to share that. I've been very fascinated with. We also went over to dot zero volcano. How many of you have been there? How many of you know about it? We went there last week, and it's a pretty interesting site. You know, it's the youngest volcano in Colorado, erupted 4,200 years ago. All right, is that all right? Is that enough? Interesting stuff. So you know that if you were here probably several million years ago, this church would probably be part of the Book Cliffs. You know, it seems like it might be. All right, thanks for bearing with me. Have a good week.
been watching a talk given by Reverend Doug Bottorff here at Independent Unity in beautiful Grand Junction, Colorado. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really helps us spread our message. If you would like to support us, you can do so by clicking the button in the right-hand corner of the video screen. We greatly appreciate your support. Thanks again for watching.